Should we try saying something to see if there's a transcript? Wonderful.
We'll be getting started in just a few moments as we wait for people to come into the Zoom room. So thank you all for your patience, and we'll be getting started real soon. All right, I think we'll get started. I'd like to welcome you today to Perspectives on Language, Ethnicity, and Nation in the Russian-Ukrainian Conflict. You're here today with Asya Pereltvaig, Volodymyr Dibrova, and Roslyn Burns. And Volodymyr works with the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, and I wanted to draw your attention on their website to the publications under the resource tab to learn more about this important topic. We are going to have 3 talks today. Roslyn Burns will go first, and then Asya will go second, and Volodymyr will go third. And so I'm going to turn it over to her. There will be time for a question and answer at the end. Please use the question and answer panel, and I will try to direct their questions, your questions to the correct panelist or panelists who will be speaking to those. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Roslyn.
Thank you very much. My name is Roslyn Burns, and I hope that you can all see my screen right now. I kind of want to begin today's talk by contextualizing the shifting nature of Russian identity, which is what I believe to be one of the major factors that was involved in the initiation of this war by Russia. Basically, I'm going to provide historical contextualization, and from there we will go on to Asya and Volodymyr's talk. So when we talk about language, we really need our conversational partners to understand not only the individual words that we use, but also what those words refer to. So over time, either of those associations may change. So for example, if we look at these 2 images here, you'll notice that there's an image on the left of a dish and there is an image on the right of food. For those of you who are familiar with these, you might call both of these casserole. And in fact, they both are called casserole. But the reason that they have that name is kind of interesting historically. It is a relationship of casual association. So historically, the dish was the only thing that we would call the casserole. And because you cook this particular type of food, like a sweet potato casserole, in the casserole dish, the food that resulted from being cooked in that dish eventually got that name, once again, by casual association. So when we think about what things mean. In particular, abstract concepts can be very subject to change because it's very difficult to pin down what they mean in certain situations and in certain contexts. So for example, in English, we have words like ethnicity and race, and these two words are related concepts, but it's very difficult in some cases to say exactly what falls under ethnicity and is exclusively that and not race, and what falls under race and is exclusively that and not ethnicity. If we think about terms in Russian that we have for related concepts, we have words like narod, which is like people's customs, things like that. And we also have words like люди, which would just be peoples. The word that actually uses the ethnicity term as it comes from Greek, there is a word for it in Russian, but it is not the core sense of the word people or ethnicity in the same way that we would have it in English. So where does the word Russian itself come from? The word Russian in Russian is Ruski, and this is combined of two different elements. There is Rus, which is a people group known as the Rus, and there's a suffix ski, which is kind of like of. So it essentially means of the Rus. The Rus were a people group that were first documented in the 9th century. They ruled over parts of modern day Ukraine, and their capital is, or historically was, Kyiv, which is the present day capital of Ukraine. So there is an association of the Rus with Ukraine in particular. So if we look back to the February 21st address that Vladimir Putin gave that in a way served as his justification for starting this war, there's some things that should jump out to us, and I've highlighted them in this kind of bluish purple color. It says, since time immemorial, the people living in the southwest of what has historically been Russian land have called themselves Russian and Orthodox Christians. This was the case before the 17th century, when a portion of this territory rejoined the Russian state, and after. It seems that generally speaking, we all know these facts. That is common knowledge. So the question that I hope you're asking is, are today's Russians these very same Rus, the ones who were first documented back in the 9th century, not back in time immemorial? And the answer is they were actually North Germanic seafarers. They were Vikings. We know that Kyiv at the time was called Krunagarður, which is an Old Norse term. The reason that we know that they were Vikings is because there are Scandinavian magical artifacts that have been found in the region. So you have pendants and iron neck rings. There's graffiti that's etched on coins, and it's similar to Viking era graffitis and uses Norse runes. In some cases, there are even entire words like names written in runes. There are eyewitness descriptions of burial rituals from this region, particularly the Risala documented burial practice that was very similar to a Viking burial practice, where you kill a servant, throw their corpse on a boat, and you light the whole thing on fire, which is very Viking indeed. And the other thing that we know about is the Rus religion. It was actually not fully Christian, although there was a Christian component to it. There are actually images that are associated with the Norse pantheon. So for example, you get Thor's hammer written on certain things. You'll see Thor's name written in runes, and these will co-occur alongside Christian things like crosses. So the historical Rus do not necessarily equal the same people group as what you find in modern Russia. In fact, we seem to have this kind of shift in the reference of what Rus is, once again, by casual association. So what you had were these Viking Rus that lived in a certain territory, and these Viking Rus lived in a similar territory as Slavic populations that eventually adopted the name Rus along with them. So Kyiv actually became Russian kind of in the modern sense of Russian, the sense of Russian that's associated with Moscow, for the first time around the 1600s, after Kyiv was taken from Poland, Lithuania. So another thing to kind of keep in mind is that this is not the only time that the sense of what it means to be Russian has shifted. We know that the modern predecessor to Russia, the Kingdom of Russia, was established after the fall of the Viking Rus. One of the kingdom's most famous rulers was Queen Catherine the Great, also known as Yekaterina Velikaya. But importantly, before there was Yekaterina Velikaya, there was Zofia von Anhalt-Zerbst. So you can see the younger version of her to the left and the older version of her to the right. So basically, she was German nobility and married into the Russian nobility and was very instrumental in forming what eventually became the Russian state. A lot of what she did in order to expand the Russian state was through military campaigns. So for example, she is responsible for much of present-day Ukraine becoming incorporated into Imperial Russia. And the way that she did this is that she worked together with the modern predecessor of, or the predecessor of modern-day Germany, which was Prussia, and Austria, to basically dissolve Poland and take the land that they wanted. They all just kind of divvied it up. And this is known as the partitions of Poland. So a lot of what is, once again, present-day Ukraine entered Russia for the first time through this very active campaign to dissolve the Polish state. Another place that present-day Ukrainian land came from was from what's known as the Russo-Turkish Wars. So before 1774, Crimea was actually Turkic. It was a Turkic Khanate, which is a governing district, and Russia essentially seized the land through a military campaign. So why did anybody want to be a part of this expansion? That is kind of a reasonable question, but it's kind of this deal that's too sweet to refuse that she offered. In order to justify her claim to what she called New Russia, she wanted to put her people on the land and say, well, they're Russian citizens here, so clearly it's the case that it belongs to Russia because our people are here. And to do this, what she did is she actively recruited people from other parts of Europe, especially farmers, to go to that land and farm it under the title of Russian citizens. Some of the people that she actually courted are a group that I've worked with, namely a group that are called Netherlandic Mennonites. And she went specifically for a group that was in Poland, but as everybody will just remember, Poland was recently dissolved. So basically, Poland, where the Netherlandic Mennonites lived, had gone to Prussia, or the predecessor of the modern day German state, and they didn't want to live there. So Queen Catherine said, well, you know, you can come to this land that I have, you can get it fairly cheap, you can be farmers, we'll leave you alone, and I'll even give you a document known as privilegium, which will secure your place within the society. So one of the things that the Mennonites really, really wanted, because they're pacifists, is to not participate in war. So she put this into the document that eventually went to them saying that they were exempt from military service. So Mennonites first went into New Russia in 1788, but in the lead up to World War I, tension between groups that were generally considered Russian and groups that once again were kind of generally considered German began to rise. And the reason that I say generally considered to be German is because Netherlandic Mennonites are originally not from Germany. Originally, they are from the Netherlands, Belgium, Flanders, and they went to Poland, specifically skipping over Germany. But they ended up getting this German identity as they continued to travel. So as these tensions began to rise, Mennonites kind of had two choices. They could leave or they could stay. A large portion of the community actually saw the writing on the wall and left. This community in 1874, which you'll notice is less than 100 years after they first arrived in Ukraine, went to the Central Plains of Canada and the US, and this is the population that I predominantly work with. Those who stayed actually underwent the Bolshevik Revolution, which overthrew the government that had originally granted all of the privileges to the Mennonites. And at this point, everybody had to participate and contribute to state causes in a similar way, regardless of what your religion was. This was a very difficult time for several groups, in particular, anyone who was Ukrainian or anyone who was an ethnic minority. So this included Mennonites, but definitely was not limited to Mennonites. And this was a time of intense repression. So this is basically when famine began to develop as the Soviet state took farmlands from farmers who were viewed as kind of fat cats and redistributed the land to other people in the state and collectivized farms. There are people who were forcibly disappeared. There were settlements that were forcibly resettled, and a lot of other things that were very difficult for the population. Now, the reason that I'm talking about this once again is because this is as there is a change in the sense of what it means to be Russian and the sense of what it means to contribute to being Russian. But what happens to the people who are in the middle of this who didn't originally view themselves as being a part of this overall changing system? Well, this actually led, unfortunately, to opportunists trying to jump in. So the Mennonites underwent these very hard time for those who stayed within the region. They were forcibly integrated into what is sometimes called in the community Tridamia. I've had several consultants talk about this. It is still a very real, salient, and scary, frightening thing to them. And when World War II began to develop, basically opportunists decided to make their move. They said, there's this situation and we can take advantage of it. So this is very, very difficult for the community, and the community is still in the process of recovering from this. They are very aware about what happened at this point, and they are the ones that are actively fighting these forces within their community now. Because of the situation that developed as the ethnic and national sense of what is Russian shifted. So luckily we have very many great Mennonite scholars who are active in campaigning against these types of things and raising awareness of how these hardships sometimes lead to what opportunists would see as their chance to make a move. So some of the things that we should at least learn from this is that concepts about community membership, whether they're ethnic or national, can shift over time. The other thing that we should be aware of is the fact that territorial boundaries that constitute a people group or their space can change over time. And we also need to be aware that people who otherwise do not view themselves as participants in any sort of conflict or war or anything like that can be forced into a position where they feel like they have to choose. And when this happens, we have to be aware as a broader community to support people so that opportunists cannot come in and take advantage of them. Thank you.
Thank you. Asya, you're up next.
I'm up next. Thank you. Let me put up my slides. Okay. All right. Well, we're going to fast forward. Thank you for a fascinating presentation, Roslyn. We're going to fast forward to about 20 years ago and talk about what's been going on with these concepts of language and ethnicity and nationhood in the last couple of decades and how it all came to the situation that we're in right now. So around the time that Ukraine really came to international attention in 2014, when the conflict actually started with the Russian annexation of Crimea and also military action in eastern Ukraine, also known as Donbas region. Donbas stands for Donetsk Basin. It's a big coal mining area, and there's also a lot of metallurgy in this region. So in 2014, unfortunately, much of the global media sort of bought into the narrative that Putin's propaganda has been selling to the world. So many Western newspapers, American, British, and elsewhere, came out with a narrative that I call the tale of two Ukraines. So for example, the Washington Post published this map that you see here, showing kind of nicely in Ukrainian national colors that there's sort of two halves to Ukraine. There's a more Russian-speaking part of Ukraine in the east, also in the south and Crimea. And there's the more Ukrainian, properly Ukrainian part of Ukraine in the central and western parts of the country. But this map is very misleading, as we'll see. And arguably the Guardian's map about the same sort of split right down the middle of Ukraine is even worse. But I'm going to challenge this narrative and show you both why it's wrong and also how it's changed in the last 8-10 years. So is Ukraine really split into two, as these maps would make it appear? Well, it's kind of complicated, because if we look at the recent political history of Ukraine, we see a very clear divide in exactly that area that those maps show, into the eastern and southern part of Ukraine that votes for more pro-Russian candidates or pro-Russian parties, versus the central and western part of the country that votes for more nationalist, pro-European politicians of a different sort of different persuasion. This map here is the Ukrainian presidential election of 2010. If we go back further to 2004, the first Orange Revolution, the first Maidan, we see the exact same division. And look at how polarized Ukraine was at the time, with some areas voting 90% for one or the other candidate. So extremely polarized, but again, there is a pretty clear divide along the very same line. And we see the same line in the sand, so to speak, on land, on political maps, on voting maps from legislative elections, with again, the eastern and southern part of Ukraine voting for a more pro-Russian party, historically more for the Communist Party in 2002 elections, and for the Party of the Regions, the most pro-Russian party in other elections. So it's certainly a political divide that we see in Ukrainian recent political history, but it's also a divide in its physical geography and its historical geography. The southern part of Ukraine is a steppe zone, which historically supported semi-nomadic and nomadic peoples, while the center and the north are marshy, foresty areas that supported slash and burn agriculture. So they're very different in terms of their physical geography, and very different groups settled there. In the southern steppe zone, which is sort of the western tip of a much bigger area of open grasslands, the steppes that goes all the way to the Russian-Mongolian border in the east. So here we have these peoples of the steppes, often on horseback, the Kumans, the Pechenegs, the Polovtsi, that come and go in those steppe zone. In the foresty zone in the north, we see the East Slavs, the descendants of those people who adopted the term Rus, as Roslyn so well explained to us. So historically, very different halves of Ukraine. And again, we see it in later time periods, like in 1400s. The southern part is part of the Golden Horde, Genghis Khan's empire. And in Crimea, that Crimean Khanate was there still in the 1600s and into the 1700s when it became part of the Ottoman Empire. While the central and western part of Ukraine was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, that country that was dissolved under Catherine the Great. And again, thanks, Roslyn, for setting up that historical context. So there is some historical and political reality to that division, but that is also the division in terms of ethnicities and languages in more recent times. And the answer is no. Well, the most recent data about different ethnic and linguistic groups in Ukraine comes from the 2001 population census, because later when they were ready to do the next census, the whole issue of language and ethnicity was so hot, like it just wasn't possible or fair to run to do the census. So if we examine these maps, what we have here, the yellow map is the percentage of the population who claim themselves to be native speakers of Ukrainian, and the gray map is the percentage of the population that claim Russian as their native language. What we see is that it's not true that the entire southern half of Ukraine speaks predominantly Ukrainian. Only in 3 areas in Crimea, including Sevastopol, which is sort of a separate urban area for administrative purposes, as well as in the Luhansk and Donetsk regions in Donbass, we have a majority Russian-speaking population in 2001, but elsewhere in southern and even eastern Ukraine, the majority of their population claim Ukrainian as their mother tongue. So a more accurate version of that map from Washington Post would not color so much of it in blue. To be fair, they're actually saying the legend that these lighter shades of blue mean 20 or 30 or 40% are Russian speaking, but nobody actually reads a legend when they read the newspaper, right? They just look at the map and it makes it really look like the southern half is all Russian, but it isn't. So the map I have at the bottom here is the more accurate version of this Washington Post map. An even more detailed map of native languages like this one, and I'm purposefully not talking about other languages and ethnicities because I had to keep my presentation short. So just focusing on Ukrainian and Russian languages, well, we see that even in those regions where bigger maps show, less detailed maps show that there's, just a sea of Russian speakers, actually they cluster in large cities, in Kharkiv, Luhansk, Donetsk, Mariupol, Berdyansk, Melitopol, Zaporizhia, Sumy, and so on. So when I hear, Putin's justification that he's protecting the Russian speakers in Eastern Ukraine, he's bombing the very cities where Russian speakers have lived in recent decades. So it's completely outrageously wrong and fake claim. But we have to also sort of be careful about some distinctions here. And I wanted to continue this theme that Roslyn talked about in terms of language versus ethnicity. Not everyone who claims Russian as their mother tongue in Ukraine is an ethnic Russian. In fact, if you compare these two maps, native language versus ethnicity, you will see that in every administrative region, about half of those who claim Russian as their mother tongue actually are ethnic Russians, and the others could be Ukrainians or Jews or Greeks or somebody else, so other ethnic groups, which might beg the question for some of you, what does it mean an ethnic Russian if it's not someone who speaks Russian? Well, in Eastern Europe, which is where I'm from, I was born in the Soviet Union, ethnicity was sort of an identity notion that was largely based on who your parents are and primarily who your father is, although not always, strictly going by the father's ethnicity. And it was something that was not a matter of, for you to choose. It was something that was in your documents, starting with your birth certificate and your passport and everything else. Right after the name and your date of birth was your ethnicity, as determined by some state official when the document, your birth certificate was given out. So it's not a matter of choice that you're going to say, I'm Ukrainian or I'm Russian. It's something that was kind of assigned to you. And then kind of passed along in terms of, from parents to children. So it's roughly who you are by blood, but not exactly. And not everyone who is ethnic Russian speaks Russian as their mother tongue, and vice versa. Not everyone who is who speaks Russian as their first language is an ethnic Russian. I am myself in that second group. Russian is my native language, but my birth certificate says Jewish, so doesn't say Russian. So those are kind of overlapping sets, but they're crucially not the same thing. And also, what somebody's mother tongue is not always the language that they always use later on. Like now, this is the language they learned when they were babies, but this is not necessarily the language that they predominantly use. And what I have here on the right, the gray map already solved native Russian speakers, but the map on the right is from a survey that was done in 2003, kind of before all of this conflict with Russia really sort of began. And it tried to show where Russian was in common use as a sort of a dominant language of everyday life. And it's a much broader area than where we have a Russian-speaking, a native Russian-speaking majority or even plurality. One question I often get is how different Russian and Ukrainian languages are. It's hard to answer the sorts of questions because we don't have like a yardstick to tell, you know, that many kilograms or that many inches or whatever, right? There's not a unit of how different languages are. But generally speaking, Russian and Ukrainian are fairly similar. And within Ukrainian language, there are dialects sort of towards the eastern part of the country that are more similar to Russian. And guess what? In southern parts of Russia that border Ukraine, they also speak in a way that's very similar to Ukrainian. So there's kind of a dialectal continuum. And as we move west through Ukraine, Western Ukrainian dialects are more similar to Polish. Unsurprisingly, because that part of Ukraine was under Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and under Polish linguistic and political and cultural influences. But another important thing to note is often there's this impression that there's Russian-speaking people in Ukraine, and there's Ukrainian-speaking people in Ukraine, and there's like an iron curtain between these two groups. The Russians only speak Russian, and there's these Ukrainians who only speak Ukrainian. And this could not be further from the truth. So already in the 2001 population census, from which this table was lifted, or part of the table, I didn't include all of the ethnic groups that were listed, already shows that that's not really true. Let me walk you through some crucial figures here. So let's look at the line that says Ukrainцы, Ukrainians. 11% of ethnic Ukrainians who say that their mother tongue is something other than Ukrainian, probably Russian, claim to also be fluent, not just understand some Ukrainian, but be fluent in Ukrainian. And 43% of ethnic Ukrainians who claim something other than Russian as their mother tongue, probably Ukrainian, also say that they're fluent in Russian. And then in the next line, Ruskiye, Russians, ethnic Russians, 3% of ethnic Russians claim something other than Russian as their mother tongue, but also say that they're fluent in Russian. And then 55% claim something other than Ukrainian, probably Russian as their mother tongue, and also say that they're fluent in Ukrainian. So the upshot of this is about 60% of ethnic Russians and 60% of ethnic Ukrainians are actually fully fluent in both Russian and Ukrainian. It's just one or the other is their first language, and then they're fluent in whatever happens to be the other language. And many of the other 40% are also, if not fluent, but also speak and understand the other language, not the one that is their mother tongue. So generally in Ukraine now, there's the majority of both ethnic Russians or ethnic Ukrainians actually, at least to some extent, speak the other language that's not their mother tongue. So it's not just like two groups that can't find a common language. And another thing that's very important to note is this conflict, the last 8 years, actually, instead of attracting the supposedly more pro-Russian or Russian speaking or Russian something part of Ukraine towards Russian sphere of influence, actually pushes it away. And more people in Ukraine are seeing less and less room for Russian as an official language, a co-official language, or as one of those languages that the educational system is conducted in. So that is a tendency that was already noted in 2015, 2014, but it still sort of continues in the same direction. And even politically, in the last presidential election in 2019, we no longer see that divide, the tale of two Ukraines, that divide through the waistline of Ukraine. Rather, except for these westernmost part, the Lviv area, the rest of Ukraine voted for Zelensky, who's now president and really sort of unified the nation quite well in its defense against Russian aggression. So the take-home message is that citizenship is not the same as ethnicity, which is not the same as someone's native language, which is not the same as the language one actually uses to choose. And it's interesting, as I've been following Ukrainian media and social media, and even some TV shows that have been running for several seasons, that people choose to speak more Ukrainian, even people who consider themselves speakers of Russian or ethnic Russians. So these things are not lines in the sand, and there's not a huge divide into, you know, two halves of Ukraine that can't find a common language. And rather, the ethno-linguistic situation, it's not really the cause of the conflict. It's not why Putin had to go in and defend the sort of the southern half of Ukraine, the Russian populated half of Ukraine. But the situation is affected, and the more Russia meddles in Ukraine and more attacks it militarily, the more, even the more pro-Russian parts historically are now shifting towards a more unified political nation. And in my opinion, Ukraine made some very successful strides away from that sort of 20th century narrative in terms of ethno-linguistic lines, who's ethnic this and ethnic that, and what language you speak, and in the direction of building a political nation. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Volodymyr, it's your turn next to speak.
Thank you. First of all, it's a great honor to be here. Thank you for having me. And I enjoyed both of these presentations. And I have to apologize because I don't have a PowerPoint thing, because I thought we would be talking about the war, not the crisis, not the conflict, but about the war. But we are academics, and I'd like to tell you a couple of words about myself. So I spent 40 years in the Soviet Union, so I'm a Soviet product through and through. And I was born in Donbass, and all my relatives come from Donbass, which is the eastern Ukraine. And a couple of points. First of all, the issue of language becomes the bone of contention only during the elections, when politicians wanted to speculate and turn it into some more votes. And there's some nonsense. And obviously, the language is not the cause of Russia's war on Ukraine. So it has never been the case. So I think I'd like to make another point about this ethnicity. This is the remnants of the Soviet past, because as you know, the fifth line or section of every passport and every anketa was about your nationality. And it's interesting how it all evaporated, disappeared in contemporary Ukraine, where everyone became a Ukrainian all of a sudden. Nobody cares what language you speak and what's your DNA makeup. So okay, so since my time is limited, I'd like to go back to some of the myths that are behind a Russian attack. And I think it's our duty as people who live in the West and who teach other people to debunk these myths. And one of them is this myth about the three fraternal nations. Well, the simple answer is that you don't kill your brother unless you are Cain, you know, in biblical times. It happens, but not in this case. Well, okay, of course we can think about Suzdal and Vladimir, Prince, what's his name, Andrew the Pious, Andrei Boголюбский, who in 1067, I believe, ransacked Kiev, destroyed everything, looted the place, and stole the biggest possession, this Saint Volodymyr's icon, to Vladimir. So there is historical precedence. But this whole myth about the three fraternal nations, which permeates everything, speak to any Russian, and they will tell you, but we are brothers or sisters or whatever. But actually, this myth was invented by Kievan clergy in the 17th century, Ion Boretsky. And the 17th century, as you know, was the time of religious wars. And the Ukrainian Orthodox were in a pickle. They had to fight Catholic expansion. And so, as everywhere in Europe, there were religious wars. And so they were looking desperately for allies. And at this time, Constantinople was no more. It became an Ottoman Empire. And their only choice was to look north and to feed them this idea of that we are brothers, so come to our rescue, help us. And the same with, Belarus. And it took Russians, not until the beginning, Muscovy. It took Muscovy not until Peter I to absorb this myth and to become Russia. Another myth is about the civil war in Ukraine. And I think it's a good thing to foment a civil war if you bring special forces and you have a well-developed plan to occupy it was a special operation everywhere in Donetsk, in Luhansk, in Kharkiv, but in some places it succeeded, like in Luhansk and Donetsk, because Ukrainian army was too weak and was non-existent. Because Russians, it took them 20-something years to totally deplete Ukraine of all the contemporary armaments, let alone the nukes, and to put in charge all of those Russian stooges. And so it was not a civil war. And the third myth is separatists. We can talk about separatists in Catalonia, I don't know, in Eritrea, maybe in Scotland, in Quebec even. But it's a mystery why a certain group of people would opt for a separate identity. But to be able to do this, they have to have some issues like the language of their own, history, sacred territory, and the list of heroes who died, martyrs. And you don't have anything like this in Donetsk and Luhansk, not at all. There was no separatist movement at all. In fact, beginning from the late Kuchma years, the end of the 20th century, all those, what we call now oligarchs, businessmen, and political figures, they moved to Kiev. And then it ended up in Yanukovych becoming the president of Ukraine. So nobody would ever thought that it would become a separate nationalist or separatist movement. So I don't think that's a valid point until Comrade Putin decided to stir up the situation and begin his war. Okay, I think I'll end here, and I would be more than happy to answer questions, if any.
Thank you. We do have one question in the Q&A, and I hope that we can get a dialogue started around it. I think it could be answered by any of our panelists here. And the question is, this seems to be a war needing an excuse for its existence. Will language, ethnicity, and location make any difference for the dictator? Is this just an excuse to rebuild the Soviet empire?
Who do you designate to be the speaker?
At this point, you.
Yes, you can speak.
It's a common thing to say that nobody knows what's on Putin's mind. And I think I know what's on Putin's mind, is to destroy Ukraine, plain and simple. And people are juggling with the word genocide, or not genocide, but from what we see, he doesn't want to recreate the Russian Empire or the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics. He just wants to destroy Ukraine. And you know, as Asya told us, that the most, you know, Russophile cities like Mariupol and Kharkiv, or even Ochtyrka, are the worst hit. So there's no logical explanation for that. So if I may put it bluntly, the world order that was created after 1945 with its international treaties, conventions, hot telephone lines, military alliances is gone. And it doesn't really matter how we cut it, but the choice now is between Russia or Ukraine. Ukraine didn't want it, but that's the way it is, because it looks like they cannot go along together. And the question is why? It's $1 million question. My take on it is that, you know, there's the French philosopher Blaise Pascal, and he says that all the problems of humans stem from one idea, that they cannot sit quietly in a room. And the same is true about Russia. They cannot exist as a nation state. They need an empire, a union of socialist, Soviet socialist republics, or right now, notice they don't say Russia. They normally say Russian Federation. I don't know whether it's a comic thing or it's in their DNA, but they need to keep on conquering lands. If you look at the history of Russia, you have the first Chechen War, the second Chechen War, then Transnistria, then Ossetia, then Abkhazia, then Crimea. So they need to conquer it. That's all. And it's not some political conclusion. This is what we see right in front of our eyes.
If I might jump in, and I completely agree with Volodymyr that it's something that Putin cannot allow for Ukraine to be prosperous. And in my opinion, it's because what Ukraine tried to do is to be part of the European Union, to be a democratic country with, you know, various problems, but still, you know, they chose that Western way of development. And Putin cannot afford for Ukraine to be successful, because it also internally to Russia gives many people an impression that maybe it's better to be like that, to be a democratic country connected to the West, you know, all of those things, as opposed to having this dictator who is going to be there for God knows how long. And it might give people all of these ideas. And just as after those yellow vest demonstrations in Paris, Putin famously said, what do you want things to be like in Paris? I think in his mind, it's very much, do you want things to be like in Ukraine? And the worse things are in Ukraine, the more he can say, you know, they've chosen that way and look how badly it ended. Let's do things my dictatorial way. It's a way for him to kind of keep people within Russia along with his rule and his plan.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you.
I have another question that I think Roslyn could speak to. I'll read it. It says, when I was learning to type, I practiced an exercise for the first fingers. By truth, bury myth. But how do we get this truth to the population of Russia and to Putin's government?
Yeah, I think the important thing to keep in mind is that there are a lot of Russias. There is not just a single Russia. And I say this as someone who grew up in an area with a very large Russian and Ukrainian expat community. And I think it's really important that people in these communities are the ones who reach out. Things like Arnold Schwarzenegger reaching out and stuff like that. At things like news anchors who go, for lack of a better word, rogue, and basically speak out against these things. There's only so much that people like me can do as outsiders, which is part of the reason that I wanted to organize this and get this together, so that mostly what we can do is educate people around us, and those people around us who have the means to reach in are the ones who will be responsible to do it.
Thank you. And
Oh, Asya was going to.
But if I can add, I couldn't agree more with Roslyn, and I think education is very important. And what struck me in the last couple of years, and even more recently this last month, it's the same people who buy Putin's propaganda about Ukraine and about politics and all that stuff, the same people who are in the last 2 years have been buying all kinds of fake news about coronavirus and vaccines are going to kill you, all that stuff. So it's people who don't have good critical thinking skills and good education and ability to work with sources and all this kind of stuff. They're very vulnerable to propaganda. So education is really key. I couldn't agree more with Roslyn there.
Yeah. Propaganda is very powerful, and all I can think of is the American Disney or Pixar cartoon, Incredibles 2. If you saw it, I don't know, where they put the goggles on your eyes and this turns superheroes into supervillains immediately. And so this is what Comrade Putin has done extremely successful. And I don't want to disappoint you, but all our Russian, friends, they verbatim repeat that dribble that was spoon-fed to them from their TV screens. I'm sorry about that. So, and even over here, we have some neighbors who came to our place and said that, okay, you know what? All you have to do is wait. Soon it'll be all over and we shall be brothers again.
Thank you. We have 2 more questions. Pressure is being put on the oligarchs, but it seems that they don't know or are unable to influence Putin. The negotiators keep saying they're making progress, but are they really influential with him?
I mean, this is kind of a hard thing. I get my information about the oligarchs mostly from the news. And the analogy that I've heard is that they're like the maids. If you are dirty and messy in your house and your maid comes to you and says, hey, you're dirty and messy, the answer is, well, it's your job to clean it up. So I'm not really sure that they necessarily have the influence that we would like, but we would also just need someone who is much more into political science, I think, to answer this question.
Another question. Do you think there's some difference between Russian and Ukrainian culture or language that we can pinpoint, which allowed Ukrainians to democratize since the 1990s, while Russia became more authoritarian in the last 20 years?
Well, it's a huge question, and normally people answer this with far-fetched conclusions. Recently, I had to work on a Ukrainian national poet, Taras Shevchenko. And I'm not a specialist in Ukrainian studies or anything, but I just had to do this for practical reasons, because I teach Ukrainian and my students want to know what it's all about. And after working on Shevchenko, on writing that book for a year, I came to the conclusion that the 2 things, the most important things for him as a national poet and for Ukrainians as nation is their connection to the land, number 1, and 2, freedom. And so I would say that these are 2 Ukrainian things. I don't know anything about Russia or about the Soviet Union, but I can recommend a couple of writers to you. Andrei Platonov, Kotlovan, and Denya Prichnika, Vladimir Sorokin, not to mention Dostoevsky.
There's actually a question that was about the term denazification. I would like it if I could get to that question.
I can try to read it out from the chat. I hear the claim constantly, often from the left, that Ukraine has embraced Nazis. How would you respond to this?
What? So yeah, this is a really difficult thing to talk about, but I used to, I did a summer of research in former Eastern Germany, and I was specifically in Sachsen-Anhalt. And one of the things that was really surprising when I turned on the TV one day when my host mother wasn't there, is that they reported specifically on the neo-Nazi recruitment rates in the country, and specifically places like Sachsen-Anhalt had some of the highest recruitment rates during that time. I tried asking several people about it, what is it that's driving this neo-Nazi resurgence? And the answer was specifically the economy. The economy is so depressed there that people are looking for something to hold on to. And you see kind of similar echoes, I think, within certain parts of the US that feel left behind and stuff like that. Once again, when there is some sort of hardship, that gives extremist groups kind of what they view as their in, where they're going to try and jump in and solve a problem by actually making it much worse. So I can't speak to the specific sources that you're talking about, but in terms of Ukraine and in terms of Nazism in Ukraine, that traditionally, as far as I know, from what I've been watching in terms of the development of these extremist movements within Eastern Germany and further east, is not really a problem in the way that people have talked about it as if it is a problem. Once again, it seems more like a convenient excuse that people are bringing up to justify something that was already a foregone conclusion. And I think that it's really important that people point out the fact that Zelensky himself is Jewish. So it's kind of weird to say that there's someone who is running the government who has a Nazi problem, who himself would probably be attacked by Nazis if they had a chance to get to him. So once again, I can't speak to those particular sources that you're looking at, but it's just another propaganda piece to say that there's some sort of Nazi problem when you don't have the telltale traits of the things that give Nazis an in.
If I may add to that, I don't know if Vladimir would disagree with me, but I think from the Russian point of view, the reason that they sort of started, I mean, it's kind of, I agree with you that it's a convenient excuse, but unfortunately, Ukraine had some very controversial national heroes. So the big name that is mentioned in this connection is Stepan Bandera. And many people, you see videos like now of soldiers, fighting in Ukraine, Ukrainian soldiers, and they say glory to Bandera. And it kind of makes me wonder if they actually realize some of the things that Bandera stood for or wanted to do and actually did do, and whether they would still be saying glory to Bandera if they were actually, if they actually knew. So again, education is key. But in the very least, he's a very controversial character, and depends who you read. Some accounts describe him as such a Nazi that would make Hitler look like a choir boy. So it's like very, very, very controversial, but it doesn't help that some people, without kind of understanding some of these things, just say, oh, well, he's our national hero. And I don't know if Volodymyr wants to kind of argue against that and has a different view of that.
He does want to argue with it. And so controversy, right? How do you deal with controversy? So you research it. At least this is what scholars do. You research it. You write books. So how many good books on this thing can you mention? I couldn't those that I know of are mostly, you know, propaganda, emotional stuff, and so there is kind of debate. So he was a fascist. No, he was not a fascist. He spent the whole war in Sachsenhausen concentration camp. So and they said that he killed Jews, but Poles killed Jews, and all of this. So all we need is a solid evidence, research. And why is there no such research? Because to be able to do this, you have to work in the archives. What archives? NKVD archives, number one. So what was this guerrilla war that raged from 39 practically until 56? So, and some people say that these guys were double agents or even triple agents. And it's not for nothing that the Allies took some of the SS Galiciana and harbored them after the war. So we have to study the history of Cold War. But let's go back to this question of denazification. This is pure propaganda or dirty propaganda. Or so usually, so who are these right-wingers? So these in today's Ukraine, there are people like Dmytro Yarosh, a very controversial figure. And then there is the party called Svoboda by Tyahnybok. And there are people who are saying that they are all, you know, agents provocateurs. And for example, they are most visible on the 1st of January, when they have these torches and they march once a year, this parade. But at times when it is crucial, when it is important, like during the elections, why we don't see them? Why don't they protest against, you know, election of, if they are neo-Nazis, why don't they protest against the election of a Jewish comedian? And who funds them? You know, to be able to print out these, why are they not visible? Why are they not in the parliament? And how, well, Ukraine voted for Zelensky overwhelmingly, like 73%. So you are quite right. And that's the end of this Manichaean myth of two Ukraines. So it doesn't really matter. And also, I was interested in this guy, Dmytro Yarosh, and who came out of nowhere. And the first time he was mentioned was when the peaceful Maidan, it was necessary to turn it into something violent. And out came Dmytro Yarosh. And I Googled him, and it was said that he is the father of 3, and he spent all the 1990s in the Dnipropetrovsk region running some kind of militarized camps. Give me a break, all right? Dnipropetrovsk region, this is the, this is Kuchma's land. There's no way, believe you me, there's no way there could be some militarized camp with nationalists. So it's all, or you can ask, you know, Pinchuk, Viktor Pinchuk, the Ukrainian oligarch who was asked by some Ukrainian Secretary of State, I don't remember whom, who said that, is there a neo-Nazi movement in Ukraine or something like this? And he said, oh, just boot.
Yeah, I'm not saying that there is a strong Nazi movement in Ukraine, and certainly not like Nazis hold power in Ukraine. That's all BS propaganda from Putin. But it's just that sometimes people don't realize because they don't know. And I'm not saying I'm the biggest expert on Bandera in the world, but I think that, again, kind of educating people about more complicated history and different narratives is really important. So yeah, I'm very happy to hear your side of it.
Yeah, and there's a, you know, Gian Battista Vico, Italian philosopher, once said, sembrano travestie, sono opportunità. If there's the turbulence, there's an opportunity. So why don't we write a book? Why don't we study it? So it's out in the open. Believe me, it will be in everybody's interest to have a good account, because nobody needs a skeleton in the cupboard or to cover a criminal or something like this. It will rot. There's nothing, it's not healthy at all. Everything should be exposed. At least this is my point of view.
Thank you. We're nearing the end of our time together. So we have one last question. There's other worthy questions in our question and answer area. We just don't have time to answer them. So the last question is, what are the implications of this conflict on other European nations? And are there other measures that could be taken outside of accepting refugees to support Ukraine?
Yeah, this is actually something that is really interesting because of the way that accepting refugees is generally structured. Europe is currently taking the brunt of this. The US can definitely do a lot more, like accept refugees in the first place, which we're currently not. But the other thing that I would say that we could do is support Ukrainian culture and support the Ukrainian language and its use. So definitely, if you know of anyone who is a refugee who has any sort of skill, in particular that is associated with the culture or the country, support that person and their skill. So for example, one of my favorite things around Easter are Ukrainian Easter eggs. I know that I could draw them, I know that I could do them myself, but the point isn't for me to produce them at this time, it's to support some of the artisans who actually do. And so it's really do what you can to support the community in its existence, even if it is currently not physically in Ukraine. There are definitely other things that you could do. Maybe Asya or Volodymyr could speak to those.
Well, if I may, I strongly believe that everybody knows what he or she should do. And so at every particular moment. And so my motto, and I'm quoting from American writer Flannery O'Connor, is that be properly scared and go on doing what you have to do.
Asya, do you have any?
Any thoughts and suggestions? Well, I think as a country, we could certainly do more to accept refugees, just like you said, and also we could do more to supply the Ukrainian army, because I think in terms of the military situation on the ground and the war, what's going to decide it is which side is better supplied. And we're already seeing that the Russian side, you know, they can't feed and equip and all of that. They can't really support their military going forward. They never expected it to last that long, and it's, you know, we shouldn't stop helping Ukraine at this point. And also helping people who, for, you know, they didn't really choose to be refugees, but they end up in different places. Like I'm actually spending some time in April doing this marathon teaching English. That's my bread and butter job these days. I'm doing a free marathon to all the people from Ukraine and Russia and other countries who want to do this, just to learn English for free for a little while. So we all try to do something that we can. And I think events like this, I want to take a minute to thank Roslyn and Katie for organizing this event and you know, giving us a chance to share our views and our expertise. Thank you.
And if I can add just one more thing, since this is the world of academia, we need numbers, we need figures, we need data. And I'd like to point you to one source, which is HURI's, Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute MAPA Atlas, which has tons and tons of maps on the religious situation. We haven't touched that issue, but there's the whole section devoted to that. Ethnic distribution, political preferences, language issues, and all of that. It's the treasure trove of information, really.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here this evening. This was a wonderful conversation. I know we all learned a lot, so thank you all. And thanks for Roslyn for putting the panel together. And hope that you all have all your questions answered. I know there were a few that we didn't get to, but thank you all and have a good evening.